afternoon, everybody. My name is Zoe Thompson, and I'm the Senior Infrastructure Advisory Consultant at ACOM. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon on the webinar on assessing climate change risks in New Zealand. As many of you already know, the Women's Infrastructure Network, also known as WIN, was launched by Infrastructure New Zealand at the Building Nations Symposium in October 2016. The purpose of this group is to increase the number of women in leadership roles, grow the visibility of women, and to provide a network and support a group for women in the infrastructure sector. In partnership with Infrastructure New Zealand, WIN hosts events, advocates for greater representation of women in the sector, and provides opportunities and tools. We're proud to facilitate a diverse network of women at all levels working across New Zealand infrastructure sector. The WIN New Zealand sector is also connected to the global WIN network operating in Canada, the USA, the UK, and Australia. WIN New Zealand currently has 7 chapters in operation with over 1,700 members nationwide. So with regards to housekeeping for today, I'll be monitoring the Q&A session, and we'll ask Victoria some of your questions at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's session, Victoria Chancher, who's also from ACOM. Victoria is an Associate Director and ACOM Sustainability and Resilient Practice Lead in New Zealand. She's a social and environmental scientist and has worked with a range of private and public sector organisations on climate change adaptation, resilience and disaster risk reduction, including as a strategy partner for 100 resilient cities and for a range of governments across the Asia-Pacific region. She was a technical lead for New Zealand's first climate change risk assessment, which was very recently completed and submitted to the Ministry for the Environment. Victoria has an in-depth experience in government policy and strategy, and having joined ACOM from Victoria Department of Premier and Cabinet, she understands the complexities of the political and regulatory environment in which government decision-making occurs, and is passionate about helping clients to navigate disruption and build resilient infrastructure and communities. Over to you, Vic.
Thanks, Zoe. Oh, I am on mute. Excellent. I've mastered the first part of the presentation. Just bear with me, everyone, while I share my screen with you. Well, kia ora, everyone. I'm Victoria, as Zoe mentioned. It's a pleasure to be joining you this lunchtime. I see we have excellent attendance, so I thank you all for your time, and hopefully we'll be able to give you something worth your while in the next 40 minutes or so. So as Zoe mentioned, I'll be providing a bit of an overview on the National Climate Change Risk Assessment. It will be quite a high-level overview for reasons that I'll explain through my presentation. And hopefully, if we have some time, I'll also touch on climate risk assessment at other scales and how we can make it more relevant to the day-to-day work that most of you do in the infrastructure sector. All right, so great. Second slide has clicked. Off to a good start. So in terms of the presentation today, we'll be looking mostly at a bit of an introduction to the NCCA, an overview of the process. Hopefully some of you had the chance to be involved in the stakeholder engagement for the project and might know a bit about it already. A little bit of discussion around findings and challenges, although you'll see what I mean there shortly. And then discussion of next steps. And hopefully if we have time, talking a bit more about addressing climate change risks at other scales and the TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. As Zoe mentioned, as I go through, feel free to post any questions you might have on the Q&A, and we'll address as many as possible in the session at the end of the presentation. Okay, so first, cab off the rank, the National Climate Change Risk Assessment. So the NCCA identifies the risks that are most significant to New Zealand that we face from climate change. It identifies potential areas of opportunity that climate change might bring, as well as looking at potential gaps in knowledge that might help us address climate change in the future. So the risks outlined in the NCCA are at a high level, and they draw on existing evidence and reports and assessments already completed, and the considerable body of work that's already been undertaken in New Zealand. The NCCA provides the best available evidence and the assessment of risks and opportunities and gaps to decision makers to support a planned approach to adaptation. And we'll talk a bit more about that when we get to next steps. So the NCCA has the following objectives, as you can see on the screen. One is to provide an overview of how New Zealand might be affected by climate change, both risks, opportunities and gaps. Inform the National Adaptation Plan, which will follow on after the NCCA, and to support stakeholders to better understand climate change risks. Right, random picture. Why am I showing you this picture? So the next question I have for us all and for me is, why the NCCA? So the key reason is our climate is changing. Most of you in the infrastructure sector are probably already quite engaged in climate risk work. It's unequivocal that human-induced greenhouse gas emissions are warming the global climate system. Climate change is already affecting New Zealand, as you can see by this picture of glacier. And this will continue over the next century. Temperatures have increased, glaciers have melted, the sea level's rising, and it will continue to do so. Such impacts will have a range of implications across a whole range of domains of value to life in New Zealand. So the NCCRA focuses on 5 domains that are intrinsically interconnected, but as a starting point to understand the different risks in different areas, the assessment is split into 5 areas: the natural environment, the built environment, the economy, the human domain, and the governance domain. So New Zealand is committed to climate adaptation as well as mitigation, and the Climate Change Response Zero Carbon Amendment Act provides the framework for which New Zealand can implement a clear and stable approach to addressing climate change. As part of that act, New Zealand is committed to identifying risks and opportunities through a national climate change assessment every 6 years. So this NCCRA is the first one, and it will be repeated every 6 years following on as new evidence arises. Following from the NCCA, as I mentioned, there'll be a National Climate Change Adaptation Plan, which again will be updated on a similar cycle. So the primary audience for the NCCA is the central government. However, it is strongly recognised that the NCCA is going to be of interest to a broad range of stakeholders, including iwi, hapu communities, local governments and organisations. All right, the team, the exciting part. And I'm hoping some of our team might actually be on this call, but there's quite a few of you, so I haven't waded through the list yet. But the NCCA was undertaken over a period of 9 months by a diverse multidisciplinary team with academics and consultants led by ACOM, but also with Tonkin and Taylor, Latitude Strategy and Communications, NIWA, and a range of universities and independent contractors. So you can see us there, and that's not even the full team. It's just a snapshot of some of our team members. Our co-matua is Sir John Clark, and the people responsible for leading work associated with the 5 domains you can see along the bottom. We have Judy Lawrence, Anita Reeford, Paula Blackett, James Hughes, and John Leithwick, all from a range of universities, consulting organisations, and other organisations. Another group of contributors I might point out is on the left-hand side, our technical advisors. Paul Watkiss led a number of the UK climate change risk assessments, so we were able to draw on his experience and expertise as we went through the process as well, which we can see on this slide. So the NCCRA is based on the NCCRA framework, which outlines a range of methods to be applied in completing the first climate change risk assessment. So the methods were then interpreted to the context of the assessment, and in addition, the NCCRA also drew on, as I mentioned, a range of international best practice and lessons learned through our experience having completed climate change risk assessments elsewhere, and also through Paul Watkiss's experience on the UK climate risk assessments and other international risk assessments. Spoiler alert, there's not that many. So New Zealand is in an elite league, having completed one of its own. A key part of the NCCRA process was engagement. The NCCRA approach was grounded in engagement across all those 5 domains that I mentioned, and at the national and regional level where possible, as well as representatives from Māori groups and iwi. The project sought to enable participants to engage in a variety of ways. We ran some national workshops, which hopefully some of you were able to join, as well as more focused risk workshops that looked at each domain. We also had WHOI and online surveys and individual focused meetings. Over 400 people were engaged in total throughout the entire process, which spanned around, I think I said 9 months, 9 months. So we're very thankful for all those who could contribute their time and expertise to be involved in that process. It was not a small order. The NCCA combines the outcomes of engagement with Māori and iwi, as well as scientific, technical and expert analysis on climate risks and across the domains. Under the guidance of our kaumatua, Sir John Clark, and our Māori engagement advisors, who I showed on the screen earlier, the NCCA project team also focused the project's limited time and resources on engaging with Māori leaders directly and involved in climate change related matters and decision making. The approach to consultation as part of the NCCA is really just a first step in a longer process of engagement that will span hopefully throughout the National Adaptation Plan as well. I noticed in the I guess, questionnaire that some of you supplied that there was some interest into our Māori and climate risk. The NCCA sought to bring Māori perspectives into the NCCA through engagement, as I mentioned previously, but also the NCCA framework itself emphasised the importance of Te Māori, with the domains assessed aligning with the Treasury Living Standards framework. The Treasury Living Standards framework acknowledges the interconnectedness of ecosystems and society, as well as independencies of actions and consequences across the domains. So in this way, the LSF is complementary to Māori views and acknowledges the interconnections between the environment and people, where health and well-being are deeply intertwined and interconnected. So we use this as a starting point for the climate change risk assessment, acknowledging that, of course, there is always further work to be done. Many Māori consulted emphasised that while climate change represents a significant challenge for New Zealand, Māori have lived in New Zealand for many generations and have survived and prospered by adapting to climate change. And many iwi and hapu are already developing their own climate change plans, which articulate their values and issues and aspirations in response to climate change. Okay, so the process. So the NCCA was undertaken in 3 stages, as I mentioned, by that diverse project team, preceded by this circle on the left, establishing of the context. So I'm just going to step through these stages at a very brief level. And if anyone has any further questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A. So establishing the context, what do we mean by that? So essentially, the process of establishing the context is all about setting the parameters and the foundations for the assessment. And a lot of these parameters are outlined in the NCCA framework, which you can see on the screen there. So in establishing the concept, we have the objectives, which I've already shared with you. We looked at the stakeholders that needed to be engaged, the domains that we would be assessing, those 5 that I mentioned, and the different elements that make up those domains, the things that we consider to make up the natural environment and the built environment, etc. We then had to establish the scale of the assessment, which obviously is at a national scale, but we also looked at sub-climatic zones in New Zealand, 7 of them, and the exclusive economic zone around New Zealand in terms of fisheries. We established the climate change projections that we'd be using to assess risks, and there are 2, RCP 8.5, a high emission scenario, and 4.5, a moderate emission scenario. And we use the time frame for the assessment. So we're assessing risks in the present, the medium term, and the long term. The medium term being about the middle of the century, 2050, long term being end of the century. And then the climate hazards that we were considering. So the NCCA is a physical climate risk assessment in that it's considering risks and opportunities arising to New Zealand from the physical impacts of climate change. So a range of climate change hazards were established that we would consider how those impacted on the domains. And then finally, the criteria for how we were going to prioritise and rate which risks were of higher consequence to New Zealand and should therefore be prioritised for further consideration and adaptation. Right, so once we did that, we then launched into the 2 to 3 stages. So the first stage is what is described as a first pass screen. Essentially, it's identifying those risks that are most significant at a high level in order to deep dive into those risks more so in stages 2 and 3. The first pass screen considered how, as I mentioned, in those 5 value domains, any elements are exposed or vulnerable to climate change, what types of impacts that might have, and whether or not it might be significant enough to warrant more detailed investigation in stage 2. So we did this through extensive literature review, convening with specialists, large national workshops, and then a process of whittling down and rating and considering those risks until we had a set of priority risks. Those were then carried into stage 2 for detailed assessment. So stage 2 further examined exposure and vulnerability related to the risks and looked at 2 different sets of climate change projections, the medium emission scenario and the high emission scenario, and obviously over the 3 timeframes. Again, that was completed through extensive literature review, consultation with specialists, those targeted risk workshops I mentioned earlier when we were talking about consultation, and then a process of rating and reviewing and peer reviewing those risks. From there, the risks were then taken through stage 3, which the reason that they're grouped together in this diagram on the screen is because they were undertaken somewhat simultaneously. So stage 3 was about adaptation and adaptation urgency, assessing the risks that have been identified and considering which ones might be more urgent for adaptation action under a range of different criteria. For example, there might be path dependency involved with acting or not acting on certain risks at this time. The risks might have a longer tail, a whole range of considerations for why certain risks might be more urgent to consider imminently rather than over the longer term. So that was stage 3. So this concept of urgency was taken from the UK CCRA, which used urgency to arrange the risks in the latest CCRA 3 for decision making. Okay, so findings and next steps. So as I mentioned previously, our role in the development of the NCCA for New Zealand has concluded. Our final report has been submitted to the Ministry of Environment, and we thank MFE for their leadership and partnership in this first project for New Zealand. The NCCA is on track to be publicly released later this year. So as a result, it is currently embargoed. And whilst I can talk broadly about the process and hoping that many of you were involved and know a little bit about that already, I can't in fact share the findings. So I can assure you that there are findings and that the NCCA identified a number of priority risks across the 5 domains. Those were then prioritized, and a top 10 risks were selected, 2 for each domain, and those are all documented in the NCCA. The methodology for how the NCCA was undertaken is also documented and will be hopefully made available as part of that package of reporting. So whilst I can't share exactly what will happen with exactly what those risks are, I can say that the findings of the NCCA will be used to inform the National Adaptation Plan, which will need to be produced within the next few years after receiving the NCCA findings. The NAP is to be produced this time around by the national government, and it's required 2 years after the NCCA completion. So any further queries on the NCCA or the NAP can be directed directly to the Ministry for Environment at adaptation@mfe.gov.nz. So for any further queries, don't hesitate to ask. Of course, anything around the process and further information on that, I'm happy to speak about now or offline as well. So before we kind of wrap up, I guess, from this overview of the NCCA, it's probably worth reflecting on some of the challenges, not necessarily just with this NCCA, but I guess in general, in terms of assessing climate change risks and assessing climate change risks at a national scale. So the NCCA recognises that all of the priority risks that are featured in the NCCA findings are important to Māori and will disproportionately affect certain hapu and iwi, including Māori interests, values, practices, and well-being. Mātauranga Māori will be critical in developing a greater cultural understanding of these risks for future climate change adaptation policy planning and adaptation. Another, I guess, challenge is around cascading and compounding risks. So I feel that COVID-19, hopefully some of you will agree, has really highlighted the importance of considering compounding events with longer timeframes and longer tails that might bleed into other disasters or impact communities and organisations at the same time. And so that is a challenge in climate risk assessments more generally, even at the organisation level, looking at infrastructure and assets, is how to understand and incorporate the compounding nature, potential compounding nature of climate change risks, and also the cascading nature of climate change risks, in that a climate change risk may affect something directly and then further on down the line affect something else. We come up with that particular challenge quite often in infrastructure risk assessments when we talk about direct impacts to an asset, which might be, for example, flooding of a road, but then indirect assets might be, for example, the destruction of critical infrastructure on which the operation of the asset depends, such as power. So the cascading and multiple kind of nature of climate change risks is a challenge for existing climate change risk assessment methodologies, and something we're really interested in thinking about as we move into more assessments of different types of climate change risks. The final point is just a general point really, which is around the future climate is inherently uncertain. The level of uncertainty increasing further as we go into the future. Uncertainty, or the state of incomplete knowledge, arises from multiple sources, including data, methodology, conceptual ambiguity, unknowable physical processes, the way that socioeconomic and demographics work, the technology that we might have in the future, and economic trends and global trends. So that is a constant of climate change risks assessments at all scales, but the presence of uncertainty in results of a risk assessment doesn't mean that the impact is less likely to occur, and in fact, I would caution from any thinking along those lines. Rather, it's an understanding of the timing, the consequences, and the extent of the impact that's somewhat imprecise, but hopefully over time we can build a clearer picture based on our current experience. So furthermore, there are likely to be additional risks in perhaps this assessment, but also other assessments at other scales that we're not yet aware of due to the current limitations in our knowledge and understanding. So that's an inherent nature, I think, of climate risk assessments, and something that we really think about when approaching the assessment of climate change risks at different scales. So that brings us to the next section of the presentation, which is on assessing climate change risks at other scales. So this is almost an entire presentation in and of itself. So I'll try to keep it as succinct as possible, noting that we want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So before I leave you, I wanted to relate the work of the NCCA and climate risk a bit more to, I think, what many of you would manage as part of your daily work as infrastructure professionals. So like I said, there's enough here for a whole other presentation. So think of this more as a teaser. And if anyone has any questions, I'm obviously happy to discuss further offline. So many of you have likely heard of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So whilst the NCCA is relevant in terms of risks at a national level and probably of interest to many of you, the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures is also quite relevant and is likely to be of interest to many of you. The TCFD, Task Force on Financial Climate Disclosures, was established by the Financial Stability Board with the aim of understanding how to promote climate-related disclosures for organisations to their stakeholders and to better understand how climate change will affect their financial operation, both from a physical and transition perspective, which I'll speak about in a second. And the reason it's relevant in New Zealand is, as many of you know, this has been picked up by the New Zealand government. The Productivity Commission released a report that included a recommendation that government should implement mandatory or on a comply or explain basis, principle-based climate-related financial disclosures, and these disclosures should be audited and accessible to the general public. So let's have a little discussion around that. So as I mentioned, the TCFD talks about physical and transition risks. So the NCCA just addresses physical risks and focuses only on physical risks. The other part of the financial disclosures and climate risk is transition risk, which is risks arising from transition to a low carbon economy. The slide I have up at the moment gives you a bit of a snapshot of the difference between physical risks and transition risks. So as you can see in the National Climate Change Risk Assessment, we are looking at risks related, for example, around the potential for hazards to damage infrastructure and to reduce assets, and then also to affect the economic system, etc. Whereas transition risk is really looking at risks that might arise to organisations from the whole economy changing to a low carbon system. And some of those risks include things like reduced insurance coverage, divestment from fossil fuels, changing industry standards, pressure on supply chains for available resources, and technology shift in energy, which is a significant one, which could relate to increased costs and operation. So how do we assess risks under the TCFD? Very similarly to what the process that was undertaken for the NCCA, in that we look at screening of risks for the most significant risks. In the NCCA's case, we screened all of the elements that were exposed in these different domains for New Zealand society. At an organisational level, for example, you would be screening your assets and the inherent tolerance of asset classes to physical impacts of climate change. Then we'd be looking more at the sensitivity and adaptive capacity of that asset. So very similar, again, to the second stage of the NCCA in the detailed climate risk assessment, looking more specifically at the components of those assets themselves, the sensitivity and adaptive capacity, the climate change shock, and the impact on assets. Here is probably a good time to mention that some of those challenges that I mentioned earlier really come to the fore here in terms of how we understand direct and indirect risks and how we understand the cascading of impacts from climate change from one asset class to another across the whole system. Then there's a rating process, which again, similar to the NCCA from a physical perspective, rating the physical risks. When we're looking at transition risk, the process is very similar in that we look at a screen and detailed assessment, but quite often we leave them unrated, and we talk more about the materiality of some of those transition risks. And then we have a score, prioritization, similar to the NCCA again in stage 3, followed by the potential pathway for adaptation, which many of you are probably familiar with. So the other thing to note is that the TCFD recommends scenarios to help organisations assess their climate change risks. And so there's two kind of types of scenarios that one would use, one for the physical risks and one for the transition. And so I've just got a snapshot of the different RCPs, representative concentration pathways, up on the screen. As I mentioned, for the NCCA, which was a physical risk assessment, we used RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5 for sensitivity. For the screen, we primarily focused on 8.5, and that's because we were looking for some of the most extreme impacts that would arise under a higher emissions scenario. we then checked it against a more moderate emissions scenario. So for, I guess, different scales of climate risk assessment, these scenarios are still relevant, and you may also choose to use different scenarios depending on the industry or sector that you're in and the particular assets that you have exposed. So that's just a little bit on that. And then just in general, I guess to note that whilst the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures is a fairly new concept that a lot of organisations are still wrapping their heads around, there have been a lot of early there's been a lot of early uptake in applying the disclosures, some of which are our clients, which are up on the screen at the moment. Is obviously only a very, very small subsector, but I guess just to show the different types of organisations. So property clients, airports, are particularly interested in TCFD and have taken independent steps to assess their physical and in some cases also transition risks arising from climate change. All right, I think that might be it. So we are on questions. Zoe, I might hand over to you for the question coordination.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Well, you've done such a good job. There's been absolutely no questions.
Wow.
So we'll just maybe wait a couple of minutes to see if any come in. But thank you very much for such an insightful presentation, Beck. That was really, really useful. I'll just wait to see if any questions pop up.
I will look at the participants, see if we can eyeball anyone for questions.
There's a couple of our team members are on there.
Doing everything online. Sarah, I see you on the screen. I see you participating there, Sarah McCarter. Sure you don't have any questions? And Alex. Hi, Alex.
This is the problem when you're in lockdown for such a long time. Well, oh, there's a couple of questions.
Yes.
So,
thought you were going to let me off the hook.
Sarah says she's got no questions right now. She'll think of a tricky one shortly.
No,
so we've had a question come in that says, will the adaptation plan be carried out in national level or local government level?
This is where I hate to tell you, even though I begged you for questions, I'm afraid I'm not the one to answer that for you. We don't know very much about the adaptation plan at this stage, other than that it will be developed and it will be undertaken by the national government, developed by the national government. The way that it will be implemented, I'm not at liberty to say. Sorry.
Okay. So the next question is, thanks, Victoria. Any chance we could get a copy of the slides afterwards, which I'm pretty sure you're happy to circulate. This is
Absolutely.
also on the YouTube channel, which you will be able to see afterwards. There's another question here. So where are the gaps in data and what is the plan to fill these?
So I can't tell you too much about the gaps, again, because the report is currently embargoed. I'm afraid this made the presentation a lot less interesting. So I'm so sorry, probably should have told you all at the beginning so you could hop off and enjoy your lunch. So I can't identify specifically the gaps. Some of them we talked about throughout the presentation. Others I can say are not going to be surprising and have indeed been identified in previous work by the national government already. So obviously we've picked up on some of those previously identified gaps and they're reflected in the document.
Okay. This is another one you might not be able to answer, but thanks for your presentation. Can you give some examples of how the findings might be used? Is it focused on privately owned physical assets, public, or both?
Okay, this I can sort of answer. So as I mentioned, the findings are at a national level. So they're quite high level, they're quite broad, and they are written in a way that I guess applies across all kind of regions across New Zealand. Some of them are more, some of the risks identified are more specific to certain sectors and organisations than others. So I guess the answer there is for certain organisations or asset owners. Some of the risks may be particularly relevant to consider in your own climate risk assessments and your own risk management planning and adaptation planning. So there are some that are kind of, I guess, sector specific in that sense. Others are, as you know, based on domains. So perhaps if your business or your particular area is particularly interested in a domain, for example, the social or the economy domain, the risks in that domain may be of particular interest to you. So in that way, they could be taken and made and localized to your specific context, your organization or your council or your business. So there will be relevance, I think, to, I guess, to individual actors from those risks. It'll vary depending on if you're an organization or a community group, for example, or council. And so they can certainly be, I guess, supportive of prioritization and consideration of climate risks that may be relevant to your organization. Hopefully that answered your question in a diplomatic way.
Okay, another one here. So what were the biggest challenges in the NCCRA process, and what would you recommend might be done differently next time?
Don't get me in trouble. I think that
you can only answer certain things, I know. So just
the team might agree that one significant challenge is the time frame that we were delivering the project under as a national assessment. I think it's pretty open, hopefully, to say that we're undertaking quite a huge task in a compressed period of time, and I assume that future assessments will learn from that particular experience and also have a bit of a starting point, given that there's already been one assessment undertaken. So for a first assessment, starting not from scratch, because as mentioned, we did build on a lot of work already undertaken across New Zealand and the framework, of course, but starting relatively fresh. It was challenged to complete the project in that time frame with the amount of consultation and review that was undertaken.
One of our team members here, James, has asked, can you talk about the TCFD type risk assessment uptake in Australia as compared to New Zealand and risk processes that are being followed?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question, James. This I can talk about, thank goodness. So there has been reluctant uptake of TCFD in Australia, although there are, similar to New Zealand, drivers from a governance perspective and also from a regulator perspective to encourage organisations to take up disclosing their climate change risks. The process is, again, despite that though, the process is still slow. We're seeing a lot of our early adopters are asset owners in the property sector, and that is more because there is a bit of a trend, I think, with their peers in the market to do disclosures, financial disclosures, and there's also a bit of an enabling environment in some of the, I guess, peak bodies and sector groups to undertake assessment. It's also a very clear, I guess, incentive from a property development perspective to consider how climate and transition risks might affect their portfolio and how that'll be managed. So I guess the upshot of that is there is clear uptake in the property sector and quite strong. There's emerging uptake in other sectors, hopefully driven by more regulation around climate-related disclosures and guidance, but it's very early still as well. And there is, I guess, a lot of kind of confusion around the best way to take things forward, and also a bit of an uphill battle, I think, in terms of putting things on the agenda at this particular time, that being the post-COVID times. Very difficult, I think, to get a number of initiatives moving immediately. So hopefully that answers your question.
What are your thoughts on how widely the TCFD should be applied, and to listed companies only or more widely?
Yes, I hear this is a big topic of discussion at the moment. So again, I'll try and have a diplomatic answer. As a client, but I will preface my answer with the fact that I'm a climate risk practitioner. So I believe very strongly that all organisations should understand the risks that climate change poses to their business from a physical perspective, but also from transition to a low carbon economy, particularly in New Zealand, where there are very strong commitments to transitioning much more stronger than some of our neighbours, shall we say. The impact of transition is more urgent and more of a focus. And so in that situation, it's absolutely critical to be able to plan for how those particular risks might affect the organisation. Obviously, for listed companies, they have an obligation to their stakeholders, but non-listed companies and organisations can also obviously benefit from disclosures for their own information and risk planning.
2 more questions. So in what way are Māori interests disproportionately affected by climate change risks? And do you have any examples?
So I will tell you that there is a list in the report, so that will give you the exact answers. But talking around the exact answers, I guess I can say that there are a number of broad social risks that have been identified in the NCCA that will impact a range of stakeholders, including vulnerable stakeholders. Some of the impacts to Māori are very closely linked to land and land ownership and community connections, and also just the intrinsic interconnections, I think, between Māori and some of the natural environment risks that we're seeing. So I'm not going to say much more because I don't think I'm allowed, but read the NCCA.
And so that actually entertainingly brings us to the final question that we've had, which is just an explanation again as to why the report is embargoed. I'll let you take that. I mean, I can answer a bit. I'll let you take that one, Vic.
Oh, yes. So we finished our assessment and the assessment was handed over to MFE. And so there'll be a process of, I guess, reviewing and finalising that document so that it can then be made publicly available and tabled in Parliament. So it's quite a convoluted and long process that I can't speak to as a non-MFE person. But it's, I guess, a normal process for government reporting of this level. So whilst our work is done, the report belongs to MFE. And so any queries about the specifics of the report should be directed there. And obviously, we're very happy to talk to you about the process that we undertook, and hopefully you've all been able to be involved in some way. But the contents of the report, again, will just be kept, under wraps, I think, until the report is officially released.
Great, thank you. We've had one more question, if you're willing.
Oh, please. Great. Lots of time. Ask away.
Are there standards that you would recommend infrastructure organisations use in regards to emissions management that would help in responding to TCFD requirements?
Very specific. Not off the top of my head. I think in terms of the transition risks, there are a number of scenarios that we could recommend for scenario analysis, in addition to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change representative concentration pathways, which was the diagram I showed with the numbers and emissions. Some organisations, depending on your industry, there are other scenarios available for how the transition to a low carbon economy might play out. And I guess the recommendation there is to use a scenario-based approach to understand the risks before applying potential, before developing or identifying potential ways to reduce that risk.
Great, thank you.
Welcome.
I think, I'm just checking, sorry, I'm just running through I think that's all the questions, unless I'll give it maybe 30 seconds and then I'll just do a wrap up.
Sure.
30 seconds is quite a long time. Thanks very much, Vic, though. That was really, really insightful. Having been a member of the project, I definitely learn more every time I hear you speak about it. So thank you. And hopefully lots of people on the call. I think there was quite a good number of participants, and also it'll be available, as we said, on the WIN YouTube channel. So feel free to go and share this and rewatch if there's anything that you missed.
Oh gosh, please don't rewatch.
This is what you signed up for, Vic. On behalf of Wellington WIN, we hope that we will be able to see you in person next time, and we've got a number of events coming up across the remainder of the year, and fingers crossed, COVID stays away from New Zealand, and we will be able to meet with everyone in person again in the future. So we look forward to doing that. And so thank you very much again, Vic.